Many of us set out in our careers to change the world, but we soon lower our expectations when we find out just how difficult it really is to change the world. But one man, I believe, really did change the world, and it's the man that we honor today, the late Dr. Milton Friedman, who would have been 98 years old tomorrow. Dr. Friedman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976. He was, of course, a very accomplished author and speaker. He was an advisor to President Reagan during his 1980 presidential campaign, and he served on President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board during the entire Reagan administration. In 1988, President Reagan awarded Dr. Friedman the Presidential Medal of Freedom. One of my favorite observations about the impact that Dr. Friedman, his life had, is a now famous comment offered by former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, who said, and I quote, "There are very few people over the generations who have ideas that are sufficiently original to materially alter the direction of civilization. Milton is one of those very few people." One of the reasons that Friedman achieved this was his ability to take the complicated and make it easy to understand. How many eyes glaze over whenever someone begins talking about economics? Yet Milton Friedman not only had ideas, but he was a master communicator of those ideas to enough people that they made a huge difference. He took complex economic theories such as monetarism and made a strong and understandable case for how fluctuations in our money supply are more critical to determining consumption and output than investment and even government spending. He also showed how there was a close link between the money supply and inflation. Not exactly exciting topics to most people in and of themselves, but Friedman made these ideas understandable, and he impacted entire nations. Economist Gary Becker, who like Friedman won the Nobel Prize for Economics, said the one person that Indians and Chinese, who comprise 37% of the world's population, were more indebted to than anybody else for their great improvement in their situation, in my judgment, is Milton Friedman. And as Becker pointed out, hundreds of millions of residents in China and India used to live on $1 or $2 a day, but now, he said, are able to, quote, live at a much more decent standard of living as a result of the reform of their economic policies toward more free market policies, less regulation, less government, and the like. But Friedman not only impacted other countries, he impacted the Western world as well. Many of the successful monetary, tax, privatization, and deregulation policies that occurred during the administrations of Reagan in America, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and Brian Mulroney in Canada, and even Augusto Pinochet in Chile, were greatly impacted by the work of Milton Friedman. In my opinion, that is not because just because he had great ideas, but because he succeeded in disseminating those ideas. So we at the Bluegrass Institute think that that's a good model for free market think tanks to follow. Too many think tanks write reports that set up on the shelf and gather dust, and there's lots of tremendous ideas in the research, but all they do is sit on the shelf and gather dust. Instead, through a weekly column, through media, the use of video and blogs, through cartoons, through debates, through radio commentaries, through all kinds of media appearances, we seek not just to impress, but to impact future generations of Kentuckians. And, of course, it didn't hurt that Friedman was affable. He had a sense of humor, and he was so likable and modest. When Friedman, Art Diamond told this story, that when Friedman cleaned out his Chicago office to head for California, he left in the hallway for scavenging extra copies of some of his books and off-prints of various articles that academics had sent him. So he said, I have a Spanish copy of Capitalism and Freedom, even though I don't read Spanish, and several off-prints of articles from distinguished economists who sent best wishes to Milton. After the office was cleared out, I remember sticking my head in and looking around the empty office one final time for sentiment's sake. I was stunned to see a bright red, white, and blue silk banner left hanging on the wall. It was festooned with American flags, and it said in large letters, "Buy American." I felt anxious and confused. Was one of my heroes inconsistent on such a basic issue? So I entered the office and went over to the banner and examined it more carefully. It was then that I noticed in small letters at the bottom of the banner, "Made in Japan." Mark Skousen said that Friedman often joked about his small stature. He said, "I was at the New Orleans Investment Conference when I learned the free market economist extraordinaire Milton Friedman died on November 16th. He was a dear friend. I was probably the last person to go out to lunch with Milton. We met at his favorite restaurant in San Francisco, where I showed him a picture of him standing next to John Kenneth Galbraith, the premier Keynesian and welfare statist of the 20th century. Galbraith towered over the diminutive Friedman. Beneath the picture was a funny line by George Stigler. All great economists are tall. There are two exceptions, John Kenneth Galbraith and Milton Friedman." Milton was so pleased with the photo and caption that he sent it to all of his friends only 2 weeks before his passing. It disarmed his many enemies in many a debate where Friedman's ideas sounded so radical at a time that his enemies would nearly go ballistic. Not Friedman. He just kept teaching and kept explaining and kept going. He provided a good example for those of us who want to succeed in impacting our state and generation with free market ideas. He was indeed a happy warrior. But in the end, his ideas won out too. His mantra that economic freedom is tied to political and social freedom is winning the day. And if what has happened in former Soviet satellites, such as Estonia, which has built one of the freest economies in the world based on Friedman's ideas, one can only imagine what the consequences of those ideas could have, say, in China. Interestingly, in his final interview, this one by email with the Wall Street Journal, published January 22nd, 2007, Friedman observed that, quote, "China has maintained political and human collectivism while gradually freeing the economic market. This has so far been very successful, but is heading for a clash, since economic freedom and political collectivism are not compatible." Like the great prophets of Scripture who looked into the future and who often did not see the fulfillment of their own prophecies in their lifetimes, the full impact of Milton Friedman's work remains to be seen in our own country, in, for example, the area of education, which he committed the last decade of his life to passionately promoting, and even yet around the world. Milton Friedman not only changed the world, he's still changing it, and will be, I prophesy, changing it for a very long time. Thank you very much.